let's go back. So we talked about sort of the contents of our workshop web application. When you install Dyalog APL, either the conference edition or any of the development environment since version 11 or 10 or even earlier, at install time we set up this website called Dialog.net Unicode or Dialog.net Classic, if you say the Classic interpreter. Okay, this page that we're looking at now is the version of that page that comes with the conference edition. It's very similar to the one that comes with 13.0 or 12.1. The conference edition one has just got the additional ride element, which is a remote development environment, which we'll talk about a little bit more as the week goes on. But the main pages that we want to look at now are in this tutorial section. And we'll just start off with tutorial number 1, which is exactly the example that I went through before. It's a page that's got a button, and you press it, it rotates the text. If we look at the source for that, which is in intro1.aspx, it's very much like what we saw before. It has a function in it called reverse. It has a form in it that contains a button called press me with some text, and it associates a reverse function with that. So that we've seen before. A couple of extra things that are on this page which are sort of interesting. It has a title tag which specifies the text that appears at the top of the browser. Attaching an APL function to a button is what we see there in the title. It uses a style sheet so that it sort of looks the same as other pages in this application. It has a header, your first APL page, which we see here. And interestingly, it has this reference here to a thing called tutorial::index, which we'll see, we're going to see it on all of these pages. And that is essentially the thing that's providing this information here at the bottom of the page. It's a little tool that allows us to walk through all of the elements in this tutorial. What's going on here is that this tutorial tag here has been registered at the top of the page and is associated with a namespace called tutorial in an assembly called tutorial. And we'll look at this a little bit closer in a wee while, but essentially this again is an APL workspace that has been packaged up into an assembly. But rather than it being something that's providing an entire page, it's something that's just providing a control, something that can be embedded within a page, rather than it being something that provides a whole page. And in fact, so for example, this thing here is a control very much like the button is, and it has properties. For example, the button has got a property called text me. The tutorial control has got a property called BG color, which specifies its background color. So we can change that to be red, for example. Save this page. And hopefully now, when we refresh this, then we get red background for our tutorial. We can look at the workspace behind that, but is an example of how you might partition your page. Here, for example, as we go through each of these samples, we have an instance of the same control on the bottom of every page. Obviously, you wouldn't want to replicate the HTML that generates that for each of these ASPX pages. But defining a control that in one or two lines you can embed multiple times in a page, in different places in a page, or certainly in multiple pages, is a good way of factoring out some of the code. And again, the tutorial part of this could be written in C# if it didn't need any particular APL functionality, whereas other parts of the page could be written in APL if you wanted to split up your application that way. Intro 2 is interesting because now we're bringing in some more dynamic content. In this box we can type some numbers, okay, and we can add them to. Okay, I was trying to be too clever. And we can add the numbers together. Okay. Back in the day, I'm sure we used to be able to put a vector in here because it was APL, it add those numbers up. But if we look at the source code for this guy, which is intro2.aspx, okay, what's actually happening here is that we're using the .NET function convert to double, which basically takes a piece of text and essentially doesn't execute on it, but obviously we don't want to have execute in our callbacks on our websites. We don't want someone to execute, QuadEx, QuadEL3, for example. So rather than naively using executing here, we're trying to be a little bit clever about how we are converting some text to a number in order to add it in that. And of course what happens is if I type 2 space 3 space 4, this fails because it won't convert to an array of doubles. The trap fires and then our text just gets invalid. So just looking back at the page, what we've got down here is we have our form which contains 2 text boxes, one called arg1, one called arg2, and it contains a button which when it is clicked calls a thing called add. What add does is that it creates a 2-element vector from the 2 text fields arg1 and arg2. On each of those fields, it calls convert to double on the text. So this highlighted expression now returns 2 doubles, which we then sum and format to get a text vector back, which can then be used as the text for the result field, which then the result field appears underneath the text box button. Intro 3 is an interesting little caveat about the page load function, which if you remember I said is called every time a page is loaded. And what the page load function does in Intro 3 is that it adds a number of items to the list box. It adds apples, oranges and bananas to the items that are within the list box. And the list box is defined in our form. Here we have a drop-down list box object. We have a label and we have a button. And when the button is clicked, it calls a function called select. And select changes the text on the label to say what item has been selected. Okay. But the interesting thing about this example is, as I say, is every time the page is loaded, we add items to the list box. Now, so that this page has now been loaded, and we see we've got apples, oranges, and bananas in here. If I select one of these and hit the submit button, it tells me that I selected oranges. But what's happened here is that the page load function, sorry, let's start again. I press the button, a new instance of the page gets created, as we discussed earlier. The page load function is called on that new instance, and then the select function is called on that new instance. Now, the items collection of the drop-down list is encapsulated within the session state for this page, which means that that does persist across each invocation of page load, which means each time we call page load, we are adding those 3 items again. So each time we get a new version of the page, the IIS session state manager brings over the items that were already in it. We then add 3 more. So each time
so you're getting a bigger and bigger.
I'm getting a bigger and bigger list each time I refresh this page. Now, Intro 4 solves this problem. Okay. And what Intro 4 does, and actually Intro 4 has another little caveat in it, in that it doesn't have the select button. It's automatically changing the text as we go through. Intro 4 has got 2 significant differences. One is that it checks the is postback member in the page load function, and that basically says, is this am I being called as the result of an event happening on the object? So essentially, only add those items if it's the first time. Okay? The other difference on here is that the drop-down list has had its auto postback property set to true. And what the auto postback property says is when my state changes, automatically tell the server that it's changed, rather than waiting for some other event to happen that forces the page to be sent back to the server. Now, a push button by default has auto postback set to true anyway, which is why in the previous example, whenever we press the button, the page got sent back and then our callback got away. By adding auto postback onto our drop-down list, whenever we change the selection, the page is automatically sent back to the server and we get the updating page back. And Intro 5 is another similar example, but the difference here Again, this is now using a slightly different way of separating our UI from our code. Okay. Earlier, we saw a number of mechanisms. We had our HTML that contained our UI elements. Here's our list, for example, and our label. In the earlier examples, we might have had a little bit of APL code at the top, okay, the page label, the reverse we saw. Or we might have had a class name at the top. Okay. But what's actually different in this page is that in addition to having a class name, we have a source tag, which says that the fruit selection class is actually defined in a file called fruit.apl. And if we look at fruit.apl, here is a complete class definition that says, I'm a class called fruit selection. I derive from system.web.ui page, the same as every page that we've created derives from that base class. And it adds the items pears, nectarines, and strawberries to the drop-down list. So we could add another one to this. Next, add bananas to this. Okay, we save this page again because this source tag exists in here. Okay, IIS is now clever enough to realise that the fruit.apl file has changed, which means that the base class, the fruit selection class, is potentially invalid, so it needs to be rebuilt. There's our bananas. So, again, this is again the notion that, say we had a bunch of people that are very good at designing UI, but weren't very good at writing the code, we can separate the two entities. They can be playing around with the SPX page that contains the HTML, and we can develop the code. The next example, intro 6, is pretty much the same, but the only difference now is rather than the source code being in a file with an APL extension, it's now in a work file with a workspace extension. Again, so if there's a lot of code in there that is needed for this page, and it's not convenient just to have it as a piece of linear text that's accessible to us, we can have it referred to an entire workspace, and we can bring in that workspace as part of the fruit selection class. So we've got the choices. We can embed the code as literal text inside the SPX. We can have the code as text in a file with an APL or a Dyalog extension. We could have it in a workspace, or we could have it in an assembly somewhere. You know, we can mix and match how we want, where we want to put our code.
Any performance implications of doing it as a DWS instead of a DLL?
There is one issue that may be relevant. It's not so much a performance issue, but it's a size issue. It comes into play with the CD database. What happens is when we take a workspace and create an assembly for it, what we do is we create this dynamic library and then we attach the workspace to it. Now, if in the case of the CD database you've got a 60-odd megabyte workspace, that's all going to get bound into a 60 megabyte dynamic library, which isn't an issue from a performance point of view, but it's, you know, it could sort of chunk the disk space, but it's slightly wasteful. And what we actually do with the CD database is that it actually at runtime copies in the content of the database. So it has a small stub workspace that contains the code, and when that code is run, it quality-wise in the main database, which means that I can change the content of the database without needing to rebuild all my assemblies. So again, not performance issues, but convenience.
So any global variable is going to get tagged on to the DLL.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. If you've got, say you've got global data in your workspace that you want your website to have access to, then it will be tagged into the DLL because of the way this binding works. But hopefully you can see from this how you can build up your web pages by extending the UI, and you've got various options for getting the code in there. One of the, I mean, these examples and get more and more complex. There's one here that uses the session state, for example. For example, here, this is an example. Tony, you were saying before, if you wanted to save a counter from invocation to invocation, okay, how would you do that? Because it's not going to persist inside the instance because the instance gets thrown away. What you can do is you can use the session state. And intro 8 is an example of that. If we look at intro 8.aspx, what we've got here is a page load function that says, inside my session state, is there an entity called fruit? Okay. If there is, do something with it. If there isn't, put up an output to say you haven't selected any fruit yet. And what's happened in this page here is this is the first time we visited it from this session, so there is no fruit selected. We hit the select fruit button, okay, which takes us to a separate page. If we see in the source code for the page that we've just left, inside the UI we have a button that's text says select fruit. When you click it, it calls the choose fruit function. What choose fruit does is it redirects. Just leave this page, go to this other page instead. What intro8.aspx contains is a number of APL functions now. We've got more than the page load, but we've got callbacks for a number of different buttons and so on. And it includes the UI to allow us to select a fruit. So we can select one, we can cancel it, we can clear the selection. But let's select grapes. We hit the OK on here. And what the OK handler does, which is presumably select, is it redirects us back to the page that we came from, intro8.aspx. But now, but before doing that, it remembers our selected fruit inside the session state. So if we select grapes and hit OK, now the fact that I chose grapes is remembered in the session state, so we can pass that around amongst all of our pages for as long as this connection between this particular client and this server persists. So that answers your question before, is if we want to keep a counter going, depending on what the scope of that counter is, the session state will be exactly the place to do that.
Is that limited to being a string, or can I have some nested
I
array in there?
That. Let's just have a look. And what it does is, I believe it can be anything you like. Let's try this. Let's put a timestamp on it when we put it into the session state. Okay. And when you have chosen, so that there is the code that's going to dig it out. So let's format it at that point.
Yeah.
So we'll save that as well. Now anything can happen there, not least of which is because I don't know how this works.
Hey, look at that.
So there you go, got 10, 11, 15 and 56. So if we go back and select another one.
That's great.
So you can, it doesn't quite say you can put anything you like in there,
But it's close enough.
what it's going to need to be is something that it can serialise, that it can put into the byte stream that goes from the client to the server. But apart from that, you can put stuff in there. Okay, so there's one other website, there's one other page that I'll show you, just because it slightly builds up the complexity. Let me close all these down. There's this loan example here, which is a nice financial example. Here we've got a slightly more complicated UI, but again, it's all done in exactly the same way that everything we talked about before. And then, we've had this example for 10 years, so you've probably all seen it before. But let's say we wanted to borrow 500,000 things, and we wanted to pay it back off. We wanted the repayment figures for anything from 10 to 20 years, assuming the interest rates were anything from 2 to 10%. What this example does is that it uses the .NET data grid control, which is something that clearly just allows you to display a matrix of numbers. But what's nice about it is that it does automatic pagination for us. So, for example, we can look at the first and the second pages of that data. The code for this, again, if I remember correctly, is all inside the ASPX page. Okay, so in fact here what we've got is we've got quite a lot of APL code all in this one file. Okay, which again, depending on your point of view, is it's nice because everything's in the one place. You want to make this web, give this page to somebody else and say, I've got a page, you can use it, have it, just give them one file and it will just work. Or everything's in one place. You want to change the UI and the code, it's all in one place, you can change it at the same time, which is sort of nice. But what's interesting about this loan example is that it exists in two forms. We talked about the ASPX, which is the actual server page element of this. But it also exists as something called a web service. So this is a good example now where we can transition from talking about web pages to web services. Now, the web service is essentially a internet-facing end to application, but it doesn't have any UI. All it exposes is functional points that you can call over the internet. You can pass arguments to the thing, and you can get results back. If you know where a web service resides, you can connect to it and make appropriate calls. One of the nice things that Microsoft do with the web service is that if you navigate to a web service in a browser, then what it will give you is a default page that allows you to make calls onto that web service. So, for example, this load service contains a single function called count payments, okay, which allows us to enter all the information.
So it reads a signature function?
Yeah, we'll look at how it does it in a moment. So we're going from 20 years down to 10 years, from 10% down to 2%. If we invoke this guy, what we get back now is rather than a UI which has the stack, we get back some XML that gives us all of the figures that we could choose to display in the UI. Okay? And here we see all of the information that we need that would have been in the UI.
So if you were using Visual Studio to generate your UI, this would probably be the way you'd get callbacks to the
Exactly.
programs.
And we have, and I've got an example of that. It doesn't use this web service, but it's a useful thing. So if we look at the source code for that, okay, it's very much like the source code that was in the ASPX. And of course, there's an argument for factoring that out, and we can have an example later that does that. But this is a class that, rather than deriving from system.web.ui.page, derives from something called system.web.services.webservice. Okay, so we can't use exactly the same class. We could factor the code out, as I say, but it's a slightly different entity. But the nice thing about it is that once we've done this, we, as writers of this service, don't need to do anything special because it's being called as a web service. We just write a function called count payments, okay, that contains within it something, a colon signature statement, which we use to tell .NET what its parameter types are, what its parameter names are, and so on. Okay? And what happens is when we navigate to the page, IIS interrogates the class, looks at it, says, oh, there's a function here called count payments that's got this signature. I'll make that visible through the web service. What it returns is something called loan result. And loan result is actually another class that is defined here that contains three fields: the periods, the interest rates, and the payment. Okay, so what happens here is that the count payments function creates uses quite new to create an instance of something called loan result. It then populates that with the periods of the interest rates and the payment, and then returns this object as the result of the function. Because this object, loan result, is defined inside the assembly, IIS can interrogate and find out what all the types in this result type are and generate the XML, which is the result. Let's come to what I would argue is a slightly more interesting web service, is the old CDDB web service. Okay? What I have here, let me go back a step. Inside my default website on this machine, I have a website called CDDB. Okay? CDDB contains a number of bits and pieces, but one of the things it contains is a thing called CDDB service.asmx. If we open that, we can see that very much like one of the web pages we have, it contains only a declaration to say what class implements this thing. And it's implemented by a class called CDDB class 2. And what CDDB class 2 looks like. Okay, so this, very much like the loan thing, is a class called CDDB class 2 that derives from something called web service. it contains a number of functions. It contains a function called by, which returns an array of strings. It's given a string and returns an array of strings. It's got a function called on, which takes two arguments, one called artist and one called name. It returns a vector of strings and is given two strings as arguments, and so on. Okay. So there are a number of functions in here. There's no other data in this workspace. That's the only content of this workspace. But what the init function does is it basically says if there's no data in here yet, quad CY the stuff in. Okay, so what I'm doing with this example is that I'm conceptually separating my data from my code front end. And it's easy for me in this case to just quad CY all the data in the first time the page is loaded. Okay, you could have it all in component files, you could do SQL queries to get this stuff out. It doesn't really matter. The point is it doesn't necessarily need to reside in the workspace at the time that we init those things. So what happens if we navigate to the web service is IIS loads that class, looks through it for all the public methods and displays this nice front end that allows us to make calls on it. If we try and run the artists field, it says it gives me an input field to provide the single parameter that's passed to the artist function. And what this guy does is it allows me to specify a sequence of characters. And when I hit the button, it will return a vector of strings of those artists in the database whose names contain those characters. Okay.
Toto, seriously? You've got a Toto CD?
If we go back to buy, okay, this allows me to enter the name of a particular artist, and this will return the number of the names of the CDs in the collection by this particular artist. And there are several of those. I'm trying to get to them. If we go back to on, we can say, all right, what is on the album called Hydra by the artist called Toto, and it gives us the track listing as well. Okay. So this is something that is a programmatic, something that's visible as a programming entity on the internet, not as a UI, not as a web page, but as something that is just a little library that we can get to online. If we navigate to this from some other machine, we get the same stuff is available to us. With that feature, oh, this one. Okay, no, of course there's only one band called that. Let's go back to buy. So those are the names of all the things. But the point is, again, is we're now accessing the web service from a different machine. Again, we haven't got any UI. All we've got here is something that's using whatever mechanism it chooses to display the XML, the text that has come back. But if we want to connect some UI to this, we can do a number of things. Let's look at something in what I've got in my template directory is a thing called userservice.aspx. Let's copy that into our website. What this has is it is a form that contains a text box. Its ID is artists, and when its text changes, we call a thing called text change. And there is a list box whose ID is deceptively similar. Okay. And what happens is when the text changed field is called, what we are doing is we create a new connection to our CDB service. Okay, and I'll connect these two bits in a moment. And then we call a thing called cddb.artists, which is exactly the function that's made public by the web service. Okay? We pass it the content of the text that is in our input field, and then we add to our list box each of the names that it was returned. So here we have a very trivial UI front end onto a web service, which happens to be on this machine, but it could be anywhere. So what we've got there is a web service that is written in APL that exposes potentially a large amount of APL data to anyone who wants to see it on the internet, essentially. If we wanted to write a nice slick UI for that, then it's actually very, very straightforward. I'm not going to do it in APL. I'm going to go to an example that I have already prepared in C#. And what we do here, I did a couple of years ago at one of the conferences, I wrote this demo on the fly in 20 minutes in a session, which was pretty cool, but I'm not going to do that today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new C# Windows Forms application. So this is completely out of the box. I'm going to add a reference to a web service to this application. And the web service I want to connect to is this thing called the CDDB service. Okay. Now this IP address on here is just the IP address of this machine. So if we go to that, okay, it's now interrogating the service. It's gone to IIS and said, tell me what you know about this thing. And it's found this thing called CDDB class 2. Okay. I'm going to change the namespace to CDB reference, and I'm going to hit OK. So that has added a reference to CDDB reference into my project. Now what I'm going to do on my form, I am going to add a text box. Okay. And I'm going to add a list box. And sort of make those line up sort of nicely. First thing I want to do is when the form is loaded, I want to create a connection to this CD database. So what I need is, in C#, I need a field that is going to be a connect. Oh, hold on. Okay, now this, what I'm doing here is when the form is loaded, I'm going to create a new instance, okay, of a class that was automatically created when I connected to the web service. Okay, and this class is a SOAP client class to the CDDB class. Trust me that that's what I need to do. Now, when I change the text in the form, what I want to do is I want to get all the artists whose names match or contain the text that was in the text box. So the names are, the results are cdb.artists whose names begin with, whose names contain whatever the text is in text box 1. And then for each name in the names, I want to do add that name to the list box. Okay. Now let's see what happens if I can build this thing. In true style, let's go back to one that I prepared earlier. Okay, so this is, I've just gone back to the one I had before because I'm going to get upset if it doesn't work. So what I've got here is I have my service reference, which in this example is just called CDDB, which was created in pretty much the same way as it was before, although it must have been slightly different because this one can work. When I load the form, we create an instance to CDDB, okay, and we initialize the items that are in the first list box to be a call on the CDB.artists with an empty string, which is going to return all of the artists here in the database. So let's see if this will run. Okay, so here is our form, and now it contains all of the artists whose name contain the empty string, which is all of it. As I type into this field, okay, the text change callback to the edit field changes, and we see an ever decreasing number of artists. We just get those ones whose names contain the text that I've typed.
Now this is all, the logic for sorting this out is in some Visual Studio list thing, or are you doing that on the
This
APL
is
side?
all an APL type. Every time I type into this edit field, a call is made to the artists field web service, which returns a list of strings in this order. And those strings are just thrown in this list box, one at a time to populate the list box.
Okay. So that whole thing is getting sent over. So if you had 50,000 artists, it might take a while.
It might take a while. But there are, I don't know how many there are here, actually. It would be nice to know what that total is. But I mean, yeah, it would take longer. But that's the notion of filtering it out is so that you can use
it's doing it on the APL side instead of on
exactly.
some device side, widget side.
Okay, so that's the simple one that gets called when the text changes in the text box. We have a similar call now when the selected index changes in the first list box. We're going to populate the contents of list box 2. And the contents of this one are the items in the database that I buy, okay, whatever the selected item is in the first list box. Okay. And then, of course, this cascades through. If the selection item changes in list box 2, which is now the names of all the CDs, then what we're going to do is we are going to add to list box items 3 all of the names of the things that are returned by the CDD database function on, which takes artist, album name, okay, so it's going to return the tracks, okay, and it also is going to set the content of a web browser control that's on the floor to be whatever text has been returned by this little function here. Okay. And secret 1 is just a function that takes an artist name, an album name, and a couple of numbers. Okay. So let's rerun this thing. So let's go to these guys. So we click on that. These are all of the albums by that particular favourite of mine. I'll give you that. Toto 4, for example, now we get all of the tracks that are on there. And the HTML that was returned as the result of the secret 1 function was just a reference to an image that we're displaying in this web browser.
The image is also going to modify.
No, what's actually happening here is I'm not sure if we can view the source of this. What we're doing is all this that's being passed across here is a URL to an image, so that this web browser then, as a separate task, will go off and get the image from that URL.
So there's some web browser control over there.
Yeah, sorry, yes, let's go back to, let's kill this now. Let's go back to the UI. What I've got here is a list box, list box 3, and I've got 2 web browsers. There's that one, and there's that one there. Okay.
So when you type in the TOT,
Yeah.
it comes back with Toto, Katie, whatever.
Yeah.
The TOT in the text box is an argument to an APL function that passed back a 2-row matrix.
No, it passed back a vector of strings, a vector of characters.
Okay, a vector of characters.
Yeah.
And the thing that's selecting the albums is taking both bands' names and taking the albums? Or, in other words, how much data is getting passed back and forth between the things? When you do the selection in the first box,
Right.
is only Toto getting passed?
Yeah, all that's getting passed to the web. I mean, we could put a breakdown on it. When you type in edit field, the only stuff that gets passed to the web service is the text that was in that edit field.
Okay.
Because it knows that it's talking to the database, so it doesn't need to send
Right.
the data back. Okay. I mean, if the content of the database changed before I fill this what's got after I started typing,
Right.
then it may get different answers back. But essentially, it doesn't need to pass the entire list of albums back because the database knows.
Right, because
So all it passes is the TOT ordered by times. What it
Right.
returns is a vector of character vectors, or a vector of strings in C# parlance,
into a selection box.
which it then puts into a selection box. So, for example, the
And what comes out of the first selection box that enables you to get the albums is not both bands' names, but just one band's.
well, there's yeah, just the one that was selected. So, for
Right.
example, when we change an item in list box 1, which is the one that contains all the artist names, what we send to the database function is just a toString on the one that was
On the
selected.
one, okay.
Okay. And then when we make a selection of the second box, what gets passed is the
double string.
The double string, 2 strings, the artist name and the album name.
Right, not the whole
Not the
thing.
whole. not the
So
whole
there's
thing.
not a lot of data going
Yeah.
back.
So most of the data is coming back. There's very little data that's going to the web service.
Doesn't it come like an XML?
What happens is the web service returns it as an array of strings. IIS then says it's an array of strings. I will package this up as XML inside a SOAP container, but essentially as text, as linear text. And then the service reference that we added here, which is a dynamically created class, it knows how to convert that byte stream that came down the wire back into a vector of strings, which is given to the C# program.
How does it know does that end up file mark or something? Where does it know that it is sent it?
And well, because it's XML, so it will know when it gets the post tabulation on. I guess.
No, I mean the browser would probably know like how this, because It's not wrapping it in XML, but
Yes, it does.
the Visual Basic does.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, this C# does.
No, well, what's happened is when we created the service reference, okay, what that did is that went off and looked at the web service and got descriptions of the functions that were in there. Okay. There is then several layers of plumbing that says, oh, look, this function returns an array of strings. Okay. So let's start at the IIS end first. It says this function returns an array of strings. I know how to convert an array of strings into XML. Okay, so at the IIS end, that's what it sends down the line. When we created this reference here, Visual Studio, in its infinite cleverness, said, this thing has told me it returns a vector of strings, which I know means it's going to return it in this XML format. So that's what it expects to get back. And this little proxy class here that's been created on the fly converts that incoming XML string back to a vector of strings, which is what my programming actually says.
But somewhere in there,
I mean,
APL is sending that I have no more data to send. I'm done here. I mean, if there's a lot of data, where does it know that, okay?
well, what the APL does is when the APL function returns a vector of counter vectors back to the interpreter knows that it's residing inside a .NET application. So the interpreter converts that vector of APL arrays into a .NET object, which is a vector of strings, which is on the .NET managed heap. And so it is bound at that point. It knows how many elements are in that array, which means that when
So we don't have to take care of it. It just
no, you need to take care of very little. But which is the nice thing about this example. All the cleverness is hidden away from us. All we need to care about is I know that function is returning an array of strings, because that's what the APL programmer told me it's returning. Yes, there's several layers of stuff in between, but I know that when I get back to me in my C#, it's still going to be a vector of strings. Okay, so essentially what this guy is doing is just taking slicing further and further into the database, getting fewer and fewer strings each time, essentially, or a different selection of strings, and then populating list boxes and all the browsers with whatever's coming back. But so let's run this thing again. So if we go to, let's go to the tubes. So these are all the Amsbo tubes. One of the best ones in here is outside inside. There we go, that's a good one. She's a Beauty is a good track. So if we click on this guy, what we actually see populated down here, okay, is the web service has returned an HTML string that contains reference to the QuickTime turned up and then went away again. Let's try something that I know works with all the different things. Now there is one. Now if we're lucky, then I'll put the audio switched on. So what we've got here now then is the web service has sent, it's gone through, picked the tracks, the albums, it sent us some HTML so that we know how to view the album cover. It's also sent us a snippet of HTML that basically says, embed in this browser a QuickTime player, and here is the URL to the audio track that you should download and play. So what we've got here is just a little jukeboxy type player. It will go through all of the audio tracks which are on the external disk here, present them to us in such a way that we can go through and arbitrarily play any of the things that are in the database. Again, there's lots of building blocks here. There are, in this guide, there are not very many lines of code here, but all we've got is a few 2 or 3 line functions to populate list boxes with text. Okay. The web service contains the logic to manipulate the data, and then most of the data is just sitting there on the hard disk. So again, it's all about building up the building blocks. But the cool thing about it, of course, is that web service is available on the internet. We got to it from the browser on the Mac. We would get to it from a browser on Linux. If we had tools on those operating systems that could display the HTML in the appropriate browser, in fact, we could probably, did it work? if we go back to secret 2 here, so let's say we want to look for territory. I have no idea if this is going to work. This is the HTML that is embedded, that is returned from the thing that filled in the bottom right-hand corner. That was an introduction to a web service. So what we talked about is a page, which clearly is something that has got a user interface on it. We talked about a web service, which is something that doesn't have a user interface on it, but you can still make calls to it. Fortunately, when you're developing the thing and testing the thing, you can make calls to it from your browser, using the built-in functionality that was there. But it is very easy to create a front end in certainly in C#. We could have written a similar front end in APL had we wanted to do so.
Just as easy to tie the soap things to.
Well, yeah,
Visual
sure. I mean, let's
Studio?
look at that. Let me go.
That was a question, not a.
No, because I was upping and ahhing about whether I could show that, and I think the answer is probably why not. Let me just see what. Yeah, okay. Let's try this. One of the things with a web service, and this is essentially the steps that Visual Studio went through to create that class. What you can do is you can query something called a web service description language, and that is an XML file that describes the content of the web service. So if I do query WSDL, the SDL web service description language, on this web service, what I get back is some XML that contains a bunch of stuff that describes the content of that web service. Okay. Now, if I save this, cdbb service dot, what I have now is in ctump, I have this thing called cdbb service.wsdl. Okay, and if we wanted to look at that, it would be that XML. Okay. Microsoft provided a tool called WSDL, okay, which takes that file and writes some C# source code that sort of provides a class proxy that is something that I can make calls to, and it handles all the communication with the web service so that I don't worry about that. Okay. So what I've got in here now is I've got this thing called cdbb class2.cs. I can compile that up with the C# compiler and make a library from that. So what I have in here now is something called cdbb class2.dll. Now, I don't know how many of you have done any work with Dyalog APL to make use of the .NET framework, but let's get into that. We've seen a lot of things like colon usings and usings in the C#. When I'm writing in a session, I can use quad using and assign values to that. If I say I want to use things called system, okay, I can do things like date, time, .now, and that will tell me what the time is now. But that's calling into the .NET framework to get that. The syntax for an element of quad using is a namespace prefix because, for example, the full name of datetime.now is system.datetime.now, but we essentially indicated the search path by specifying quad using of system, so that was prefixed on that one. Okay. In addition, I can specify after a comma in quad using the name of an assembly that I want to make use of. So if in here I type /tump/cbbb, now what I can do is I can use quad new.
Does it actually have a namespace on that? Do you have to let it up? I think you made a mistake there because the way you're specifying it is the file in which system is located.
Yes, okay, let's just do that. And the other thing that I'm not totally sure about is what the class name is inside there. It might not be called that. CDB class 2. Okay. Right, so now I haven't got a value. What I've got now is something called CDBB, which is a thing. This has got a thing called artists. So if I say call the artists and do that TOT, what I get back is a two-element vector. So what's happened here is, again, we've pretty much just done what Visual Studio does for us, but we've done it piece by piece. We queried the WSDL, the Web Service Description Language, which was XML. We used the WSDL tool to convert that XML to C# source code. We used the C# compiler to convert that C# source code into an assembly, which I can then quad use. Okay, so now I have in my session an instance of a class which knows all about the XML and the SOAPs. It knows how to package my TOT up into XML, passes across to a web service. It knows when that web service returns a bunch of XML, it knows how to convert that back into a vector of strings, and the interpreter knows how to convert that back into a vector of character vectors. Okay, so, for example...
And that DLL is callable from anything.
That DLL, that CDDB class 2 DLL is callable from anything. We could, in fact, from Visual Studio, rather than have added a reference to the service, we could have just added a reference to that DLL, which is essentially just what I'm doing now. So, for example, there are 1,008 unique artists in the database. I could do cddb.artists.by. Let's go to these guys again. And this, that needs to be enclosed because the function by takes a single argument. And what I've done here is I've given it 4. I've given it TOTR. So it needs to enclose that. Those are all the titles, and there are 56. So I can do, now I can do on. That guy. Those are the tracks that are on there. The secret one. Okay, just returns some HTML that says. Let me scroll that right there. Okay, it says. Here's some HTML. There is an image in here. Here is the URL to the image, and display that width and that height. And that's all that was sent back that appeared in that top right-hand web browser in the C#. If we do secret 2, which takes a track name as well, then what we get back is the. So there's the HTML that came back that we saw before from the map, but. Again, what we're illustrating here is it's pretty easy to access any web service. The fact that this web service happens to be written in APL is irrelevant. You know, we're an APL interpreter, we're a web service, we don't know, we don't care what it is, where it is, what it was written in. But, you know, it's fairly easy to connect to any arbitrary web service and make things all they can do. So, web pages we saw, things with UIs. Web services we've seen things without UIs, but it's fairly easy to call them and add a UI onto them if you want to do so. You know, filtering information that comes out if you so desire. Okay, so those were the main things that I wanted to talk about.